Good afternoon. I'm going to call to order this regular meeting of the Committee of the Whole for Wednesday, September 11th, 2019. My name is Andrea Jenkins, and I am the chair of this committee. With me at the dais are Council Members Palmisano, Councilmember Schrader, Councilmember Cunningham, Councilmember Gordon, Cano, and also Councilmember Reich, and that reflects a quorum of this committee. And so we have two items on today's agenda, in addition to our reports from committees. And item number one is a quarterly update on the city's 2020 census activities. And that presentation will be given by Alberta Gillespie from the Neighborhood and Community Relations Department. Welcome, Ms. Gillespie.
Thank you, Chair. I was like, should I go now? Good afternoon to the council. So I'm Alberta Gillespie, and I'm the 2020 project manager of the 2020 census for the city of Minneapolis with Neighborhood and Community Relations. And I'm here to give you a brief update, quarterly update of the status of that project. And it's for you to receive and file.
Thank you.
And I do have a couple of slides that I'm going to go through. And I'm going to try not to cough through this, so if you hear coughing, please forgive me. So, let's do this. Does it? There we go. So the first slide is really, I want to lay the framework and give some numbers that I think are really important, and it really is a foundation for what we're probably up against, not just as a city, but as a state. And this is from the U.S. Census Bureau, and it's the likely number of people who will not respond to the census. And people who don't respond, those are the people who will need additional follow-up, traditionally known as the undercounted or hard-to-count communities. And so if you look at the numbers for Hennepin County, it is the largest county with the largest rate of folks that are expected not to respond to the census. And so, of course, Minneapolis is a part of Hennepin County. The next is a list of what we expect from the top 5 cities, what the non-response rate will be for the census. And number 2, of course, is St. Paul. Duluth is number 5. Number 1 is Minneapolis. And so I think this information is important when you think about the census, because right now we expect that 95,942 of our community members will not complete the census according to the research that's been done. So when we think about this undercount and that number of 95,942, that actually means something to us from a community perspective. So the state demographer's office has said for every person that's not counted, on average, there is a loss of $2,800 per person in community funding in federal funding. And that's $2,800 over a 10-year period, because the census is only done once a decade. And so that's 95,942 people times 28,000. That is what we're at risk of losing from a federal funding standpoint. And that's a significant loss. And as we know, most of the communities who are going to be in that number are communities who would benefit from those resources. So when we say what we're losing from a federal funding standpoint, in 2016, the top 55 federally funded programs received over $15 billion. That was just for 1 year, and that's just the top 55 programs. So we want to make sure that when we're talking or speaking to people about the census, we're making this information real and relevant. So what type of programs will we lose funding for? Things like Head Start. We'll lose money for Medicaid, energy assistance programs, things that really have an impact on people's lives. So the other question is always, who are the hard to count people? And so who are the folks who are in those categories that are less likely to be counted? Well, they're people of color, they're children, people experiencing homelessness, people who may have a language barrier, people who are currently in poverty, our immigrant and refugee communities. Those are the people, our college students fall into this category as well. Those are the categories of people who are likely to be undercounted. The number one undercounted group in the 2010 census was actually children under the age of 5. And so their parents may have actually completed the census, but even when they completed it, they didn't include children. And so for 2010, we had almost 2 million children nationwide that were not included in the count. So oftentimes we wonder, well, why are people not completed in the census? And there's some barriers that have been identified. There's a distrust of government. People are not sure what's going to happen with their information. So they're afraid, will this information be used against me in some way? The political climate is also a challenge for us because we have things like the public charge, which I'm sure will be talked about a little bit later. We also have ICE raids that are happening. So this creates an atmosphere of fear. And it's one of the reasons that people don't complete the census. The other thing is that we're going to have challenges this year. Some of the barriers is because the census in 2020 is severely underfunded when you compare it to 2010. So that lack of funding means that we as cities will have to fill in the gap. I had a conversation on last Friday with a representative from the U.S. Census Bureau, and that representative said, we have less funding than we did in 2010. And we are looking to local governments to help us bridge those gaps and to make sure that people are counted. And that's just the reality. And then we also know that the census has a history of discriminating and being used as a weapon. And so people are familiar with that history. So we have to educate people and let them know that there are now laws in place. But there is a history that says the census has been used in ways that it should not have been used in previous history. So the question before us is that how do we make sure that everyone is counted? Because we have the We Count campaign where everybody is counted, everybody's valued, everybody contributes. A lot of the organizations see the census as a form of resistance to the political climate that currently exists. And so our job is we know what the barriers are. How do we make sure that people are counted? So we're going with a data-driven and collaborative approach to this. So if you go visit the We Count Minneapolis site, one of the things that you'll see on that site is actually a map, and hopefully it's showing up on your screen. But on this map, the dark blue areas indicate the places where we expect there to be the severest undercount. So we know where we are going to have the greatest challenge. So our efforts from our perspective are really honed in on those particular areas. So we're looking at where geographically do we expect the challenges to be, and based on what we know about the individual community groups, the groups that we said are less likely, whether it's people experiencing homelessness, that's our focus from a census perspective. We want to make sure from a geographical perspective and from the historic groups that normally are undercounted, that we put our energies and our resources into making sure that those folks are counted. And if you click on that map, I'm afraid to click on it because I click on it and we can't get back to my presentation. But if you do, there's information regarding tracts, there's information regarding who lives in those districts. So it's really informative. It's one of the tools that we're using as we go out into community, because it's something about having that visual when people can say, that's my neighborhood, or that's my community, or that's the street that I live on. That really is starting to get people to look at this from a very different perspective. And we tie that to, if that's your community, if that's your neighborhood, if that's your street, here's what you're at risk of losing. So right now, in terms of the census, there are 3 phases on our timeline. And the first one is education and awareness. That's the phase that we're currently in. The second one is promotion and mobilization. And the third is targeted action. So I want to just talk about education and awareness. One of the most important things we can do is tell people why this matters to them, why this is important. So we spent quite a bit of time building relationships and partnerships that allow us to do this. That's that collaborative piece that I talked about. So when we go out and we're having these conversations in community, we're really covering some basic questions. what is the census? We try not to make that complicated for people. A lot of times people want to give this historical perspective about what the census is. It's required. We do it every 10 years. It was mandated by the Constitution since 1790. People are not necessarily interested in that. And so what we tell people, it's simple. It's the counting of people. The census is about counting people. It's not like an election where you have to meet a certain criteria in order to be a part of. Everyone can be counted and everyone should be counted in the census. And so it's simply the counting of people. The question is, why are we counting people? What does that mean to my community? So why is this important? So we tell people, why is that important to you? If you want your kids to not be in overcrowded schools, the census is important. If you want roads and bridges that are in good repair, the census is important. If you like the bus shelter to be a nice bus shelter that you wait for your bus on, the census is important. So we want to make it sure, do you like that lunch program, that school lunch program? That's part of the census. Did your child ever attend Head Start? That's part of the census.
Ms. Gillespie, I would add to that for businesses and corporations, it is a really important tool to do marketing, to determine where communities live, what their income levels may be, what age children live in these communities. All of those things are really so it benefits all of society. It is not just our low-income communities that need this, which they really do, but everybody in our community benefits from a fully counted census.
Absolutely. So most of our conversations, and I have a slide a little later, have been with community organizations, and so this has been our message, because the research shows us that this is the message that resonates with those particular groups. But you're absolutely right. Businesses use this information to determine, where will I locate my business? Cities, of course, use it for planning. So the census information touches every area of our lives, and everyone, regardless of your socioeconomic status, census has an impact. So we all need a fair, complete, and accurate count. So the other thing we want to make sure of when we're talking to people is, well, okay, so I know what it is. I know why it's important to my community. How do I do it? How is this going to happen? So we want to share with people there's some major changes that are happening in the 2020 census that have never happened before. So we're making sure that they understand the census is going to be online for the very first time. You can also complete it via telephone. And then the traditional way is questionnaire, right? The telephone is a good option for people, and some people feel safer with that than they will with the internet version of it. So we want to let people know the census is coming. These are the different ways that you can complete it. And also that we're going to be partnering to create safe spaces for those who may not feel safe completing it at home. We want to make sure that we create an atmosphere where people who may be concerned about this political climate and what might happen to them, a place where they can have their questions answered and they can know that they can safely complete the census. So just this, because that's our approach, we have this data-driven and this collaborative approach. This is just a few of the highlighted activities that we participated in, things that we've created. I wanted to put them all on here, but we don't have time. So, but these are key things. Our Complete Count Committee is active. They meet every month, and so they'll be meeting next Tuesday. So we're excited about that. We're also working to make sure that we have our chairs become official. And then we have had the first train-the-trainer session where we're training other people, because it's important that we're not talking about this from the city. We're actually teaching the grassroots community leaders how to have this conversation. The things that I just talked about, how do they make sure that they're out with their networks, with their organization, having this conversation. So we've also gone out to open streets and National Night Out, and some of our council members actually were a part of National Night Out, sharing that message and gave us some great pictures. Had great conversations, so thank you for that. We have been on media. I was just on Care 11 just last night talking about the issues concerning language, because we know that the census online will not be in Somali or Hmong, and at this point, by the phone, it won't be Somali or Hmong. So, and that's really important to us. So we're making sure that we're out having these conversations. The other thing is, because it won't be in those languages, the city of Minneapolis is in the forefront of making sure that we take those documents that are important, those pieces that get the information out, and we translated some of those documents into the languages that are important to the people in our community. And we're not just keeping that information here in the city of Minneapolis, we're also sharing that with other local governments. Because our first and foremost, our allegiance, of course, is to the residents here, but we want everybody to be counted. So we're sharing that information out. So there's a number of things, and of course we've been on cultural radio, and we'll continue to do all of these things. When we determine what type of activities we're engaging in, that map that I showed you earlier, that is what drives the work that we do. So we want to make sure that the majority of our activities and what we're doing is really centered around those dark blue areas on that map. So building strategic partnerships is really important. I think this work was a little different in 2010, where people were kind of doing the work versus in collaboration with people. So not only are we collaborating from an external standpoint, there are a lot of internal collaborations that are happening, which is really exciting to be a part of. And so I listed a few of those things here. I'll start with those external, because we know that children are undercounted. And that is the largest undercounted group nationwide, including in the city of Minneapolis. We're partnering with people like PICA Head Start. We were able to present to their entire staff about why census is important so that they can have those conversations with the parents that come into PICA Head Start. We also were able to present to Children's of Minnesota, to their staff, about how kids are undercounted, why they're undercounted. And we actually gave them specific messaging that they could use when talking about that particular population. So those are some of those important partnerships. We'll be working with the YMCA. They have the New America Centers to make sure that we're able to have those safe spaces that I spoke about, where people can actually go into those centers and complete the census. So we have a number of great partnerships, and that's just some of the ones that I wanted to highlight. And then our internal partnerships. We know 2020 is going to be a huge year. And so we're partnering with elections to make sure that when we're out tabling, how are we sharing information? We have a joint piece that we're using to talk about elections on one side and the census on the other. So, and we'll continue that partnership. Creative City Making Team, we're excited about the work that they're doing. They're fully on board now. And so we expect to see products coming from that team pretty soon. So that's an exciting thing that is happening with the census. IT is also that map that you saw. Created that map, and they'll continue to add layers to that so that we're telling the story about the census not in a very generic way, but in a more specific way. So we'll have some data maps, data storytelling maps that'll be added to that. HR, and then of course, what's really been just encouraging is that so many of you have included information about census in your letters that you send out on a regular basis. So we appreciate that, and we want you to continue doing that, and we will continue providing content so that you can continue to share. Some of the future activities, these are some of the things that we'll be going to. We're excited about our Community Connections Conference because the theme for that is We Count, which is the same campaign and thing for the census. The Trans Equity Summit is coming up as well. We'll be a part of that. We're going to be having more conversations with our boards and our commissions so that they can go out and share this information and understand the talking points. So quite a few things going on that will continue to move these pieces forward and create things where we need to create things. For example, there are more local organizations that are forming their own complete count committees, and we're assisting them with that. That concludes my presentation. Are there any questions?
Thank you so much, Ms. Gillespie. Are there any questions about this really informative update? Yes, Councilwoman McConnell.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. I just had a comment because we've been chatting a lot about the importance of communities of color and immigrant communities to fill out the census on the heels of the citizenship question being blocked from the census, which we know a lot of Twin Cities people helped to fight back on. And we were discussing the importance of having everyone fill it out because of its relationship to preserving and protecting our congressional seats in Minnesota. So there's a lot of different connections that are happening here that involve not only resources in terms of dollars and money, but also political representation and civic participation and representation in the federal government and in the policymaking that happens in this country. So I just wanted to share that piece of information because yesterday when I was meeting with a few union leaders, we were discussing just how important of a project filling out the census and making sure our communities are informed and empowered to fill it out is, how valuable that is, and how, in fact, you know, if we get everyone in Minneapolis to fill it out, that could actually make the difference. So just wanted to express my thanks to your work and for the conversation that you're leading.
Thank you. Chair Jenkins.
Did you want to respond?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
I want to say that's a part of our talking point and so important, and that's how we use those numbers because we lost we were close at risk of losing a congressional seat in 2010, and we only saved that seat by a little over 7,000 people responding. So, and you think about we have the likelihood of 95,942 in Minneapolis not responding, and we were able to save our congressional seat by 7,000. I think it helps to drive that home. And we also lost some representation in North Minneapolis after the 2010 census for a number of reasons, but one of them being a low response rate. So we do use that information, and I think that's important because the census at the core is about power and representation, right? And so we tell people when we go into community, this is about power and representation. It's also about funding, that's important, but it's about all of those things, and this is democracy at the very core.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm really pleased and honored to champion the 2020 census count, and I really appreciate you bringing up the political concerns, Councilmember McConnell, as I was going to bring those up as well, because it really is critical that we preserve our congressional representation in addition to the resources that the census can help to bring to our communities. Are there any other comments or questions from my colleagues? Seeing none, I will move that we receive and file this update. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed say nay. And that item carries. Thank you so much, Ms. Gillespie.
Thank you so much.
So our second item is an update on our recent federal immigration initiatives in the city, and this actually dovetails really nicely into this census count because you didn't necessarily articulate specifically who may not be counted, but we know that many of our undocumented neighbors and communities of color are amongst those 95,000 people who are anticipated to not be counted. And so the more that we can do to help those communities feel supported, the more likely it is that they would complete the 2020 census count. So we're going to get an update on our federal immigration initiatives in the city, their impacts on the Immigrant and Refugees Committee from Ms. Michelle Rivero from the Neighborhood and Community Relations Department. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Chair Jenkins. My name is Michelle Rivero. Council members, I'm the director of the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs, which, as Council Committee Chair Jenkins indicated, is within the Department of Neighborhood and Community Relations. I will present a summer 2019 immigration update, which will go through events that have taken place over the summer from a federal immigration standpoint, and then also city's response to federal immigration developments what's on the horizon, upcoming concerns and upcoming events, and suggested actions that the city of Minneapolis can take to help support and integrate our immigrant and refugee community members in this time of concern and crisis and fear, frankly. So with regard to immigration developments from June to August of 2019, there were a couple of specific events that created a lot of fear in community. One was the weekend of June 21st to 23rd. The federal administration announced that there would be ramped up immigration enforcement in select cities. While Minneapolis and St. Paul were not included, there was a great deal of fear within our communities. The federal government had indicated that the ramped up enforcement efforts would target people who have existing deportation orders already. The government took a step back from that position and said that they would not implement the plan to increase enforcement for a couple of weeks. On July 12th, news outlets reported that ICE could begin enforcement operations on Sunday, July 14th, which again created a great deal of fear. The next day, tensions rose locally with reports of an enforcement operation that took place in Minneapolis around Portland Avenue, where ICE agents aggressively apprehended an individual in his car and busted out his car window. I'm going to go through the events that have taken place and then identify city response to some of these events. And another situation of federal immigration agency action was expansion of expedited removal. On July 23rd, the federal government issued a notice indicating that it would expand expedited removal to people who've been in the United States for less than 2 years. Expedited removal is a method for immigration agents to detain and remove someone from the United States without giving them the right to a hearing. It's important to note that there are specific circumstances where a person still can have a hearing before an immigration judge, for example, if they fear persecution in their home countries. This proposed rule was challenged in federal court by the ACLU, and the matter is still pending. Another important immigration development relates to the restrictions on access to asylum. On July 16th, the Department of Justice and Department of Homeland Security published a rule indicating that people who come to the United States through Mexico, transiting through a third country before arriving to the United States, who do not file for asylum in that third country, are prevented from being able to file for asylum in the United States. This does fly in the face of international law as well as our own asylum law, and has also been challenged in federal court. The rule purports to apply prospectively, so in the future, to individuals who enter the United States on or after July 16th, 2019. It's important to note that a federal court has blocked implementation of this rule, so it is not in effect at present. Another development that's important to note is people with certain denied applications for immigration benefits being transferred to immigration court proceedings. In June of 2019, this summer, USCIS issued a policy memorandum that states that they will issue a notice to appear, which is the first step in immigration court proceedings when the government is trying to deport a person from the United States based upon issuance of an unfavorable decision in an affirmative application with USCIS. So you apply with USCIS for an immigration benefit and the application is denied, then your case can be transferred to immigration court. So in this policy memorandum, this was expanded to include individuals whose application for U and T status have been denied, which was a change in policy because previously USCIS was not automatically putting people whose U and that's crime victim or trafficking victim applications to immigration court proceedings if their applications were denied. Advocates, including here in the Twin Cities area, are closely monitoring that development to identify whether USCIS is in fact transferring those types of cases to immigration court proceedings if people's applications are denied. And then finally, and this has garnered a lot of attention in the media, the public charge rule, which was issued on August 14th. Public charge is a subject that is relevant for people who are applying for permanent resident status in specific categories only. The government identifies whether the person is likely to become a public charge based on their use of certain benefits or institutionalization for long-term care at government expense. So the public charge rule, which was issued on the 14th, which has not yet gone into effect, would expand the category of benefits that the government can look at in deciding whether someone is likely to become a public charge, and then also expands the criteria that the government can look at in making that same determination. It's important, as I said, to remember that there are many individuals who are not subject to that rule at all. For example, U.S. citizens, asylees or refugees, people who have special immigrant status, people with temporary protected status, VAWA, UT visas, or green cards based on those categories. It's also important to keep in mind that this rule has not gone into effect. It would not be implemented until the 15th of October, but multiple states, including the state of Minnesota, have filed suit in federal court in Washington. The Attorney General's office joined that lawsuit. So there's a possibility that the rule would not go into effect even after October 15th, if at all, depending on the outcome of litigation. So how has the city responded?
Ms. Rivera.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
For clarity, the expansion would include the possibility of becoming a public charge?
So the public charge rule is basically an analysis that U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services employs in deciding whether to give someone a green card or not. So USCIS looks at whether a person has utilized certain benefits in order to make that determination. And so the rule that came out basically identifies a number of different benefits that could be considered in weighing whether someone is likely to become a public charge and ultimately deciding whether to grant or deny that application for permanent residence.
So it expands what constitutes public charge,
Yes.
but not necessarily an analysis of if a person may use these services.
That's correct.
Okay,
That is correct.
thank you.
Yes, thank you for your question. So turning to city actions in the wake of some of these developments on a federal level, right after the first announcement or the first reports that immigration agents would ramp up enforcement activities, over that weekend, Mayor Fry, City Council President Bender, and Minneapolis Police Department Chief Arredondo issued a joint message that acknowledged the fear in community, condemned actions that put residents and families at risk, and restated our city's status as a welcoming city. City leaders also reconfirmed that the police department does not cooperate with or participate in ICE activity, and also referred people to Know Your Rights resources, including on the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs webpage. In the remainder of June and through the present, actually, the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs has ramped up visibility in community by participating in events in different neighborhoods, from tabling at Know Your Rights presentations and community information sessions to ensure that community members have access to resources. Thank you. To understand their rights. OIRA has also worked with community-based organizations and immigration attorneys affiliated with the American Immigration Lawyers Association to identify attorneys able to participate in Know Your Rights training and offering one-on-one legal consultations. We've also provided information on the city's radio program hours with the Latinx radio station, Somali, and also Hmong, to ensure that people have access to accurate information. Some of these events, some of these radio programs have also included public benefits attorneys who talk about who may or may not be impacted, and also identify resources where people can get accurate information, including Mid-Minnesota Legal Aid, which is a nonprofit legal service organization in the Twin Cities area that has a dedicated hotline where they answer questions about the public charge issue. In response to the July report of ramped up ICE enforcement operations, as well as the incident that took place in July of a violent apprehension by ICE agents, the city has also developed an informal protocol of response to enforcement threats that includes identifying whether an enforcement operation actually took place, creating an incident log of the enforcement operation reported, when an incident involves an allegation of violence by ICE agents contacting ICE to request an explanation of the incident, asking our federal electeds, that includes senators' offices and representative, to assist the city in inquiring further. The city has also prepared a frequently asked questions page sheet on immigration enforcement that is housed on the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs webpage. The OIR webpage is also, as I have indicated, been updated with Know Your Rights information, as well as sections addressing many of the immigration developments that I've talked about here and where to go to obtain additional information. We also have a regularly published immigration bulletin, and around the time of the ramped up enforcement concerns, had a list of resources where people could turn to. So many of the developments that have taken place demand a more comprehensive and systematic response and multi-departmental cooperation. So to that end, the office has worked with 311, with the communications department, the coordinator's office, in developing an immigration-oriented script for 311, directing people to the OIRA webpage for immigration-related updates, explaining our relationship with legal service organizations that provide advice, partners, and providing an explanation of what our separation ordinance means. In part, that the Minneapolis Police Department does not cooperate with ICE agents. We've also worked with the police department to develop a video that is used in Minneapolis Police Department training, procedural justice, that explains the role of the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs, also goes through the spectrum of immigration status, welcoming policies implemented by the city of Minneapolis, and where police department officials can go if they're interested in learning more about immigration-related developments. I'm also working with Minneapolis Public Schools to ensure that we are systematically delivering information about immigration resources to people where they are. That includes teachers, parents, and families. In addition to that, I'm working with the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs is working with the Communications Department, Intergovernmental Relations, the Coordinator's Office, Minneapolis Public Housing Authority, and the Health Department to identify impacts of rules and regulations that are issued by the current federal administration, and this work is ongoing. So there are a variety of immigration-related policies and events that are on the horizon that are important to be aware of. The public charge rule, even though it has not yet been implemented, has already had a significant chilling effect on immigrant and refugee communities. And some of the outreach work that I have been doing, I've talked with public health officials, Minneapolis public school teachers, and in the presentations I give, when I talk about this potential chilling effect, I see a lot of head nods where people know that residents are concerned about the impact of this rule, even though it hasn't gone into effect. We'll regularly need to keep community informed regarding the status of the rule and work to measure impacts to ensure that people have access to the information they need to make informed decisions regarding their use of public benefits. Another important subject is refugee resettlement.
Excuse me,
Yes.
Ms. Rivero.
Yes.
We have a question or comment from Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you, Council Vice President Jenkins. I just wanted to get some clarification about the public charge rule. So is that just for utilization of federal public benefits or at any level of government?
So there are specific benefits that have been identified, and the benefits include cash benefits, SSI, MFIP, and general assistance, SNAP, food stamps or EBT, Medicaid with some exceptions, and federal public housing for Section 8. So those are the benefits that are included in the rule. To clarify, the benefits that are not included include WIC, CHIP, Minnesota Care, Medicaid, Medicare, emergency medical assistance. I'm sorry, it's a long list, but if it's helpful for me to read it out. Medicaid for children under 21 and pregnant women, child care, Head Start, food banks, shelters, energy assistance, unemployment, workers' compensation, veterans' benefits, adoption, foster care, school meals, immunizations, public health testing, and treatment for communicable diseases. And what I'm actually reading from is a flyer that I've been handing out in some of the tabling sessions and community forums that I've attended that's put out by one of our partners, one of our legal service organization partners called Volunteer Lawyers Network. And that's available on the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs webpage as well.
That's great, thank you. I guess I just have some concerns around, folks not having their needs met at higher levels and then that falling onto us to be able to meet those needs. Has there been, I haven't seen any, but as somebody who's a little bit deeper into it, obviously, have you seen any potential increase in government and local government supports in order to be able to address what might grow as the need that might grow as a result of this?
So thank you so much for your question through the chair, Councilmember Cunningham. The state of Minnesota is very tuned to this issue and is doing outreach. In fact, there is a session that'll take place on the 16th, so in a few days, where municipal, county, and state officials have been invited to talk about the impacts and how to address the impacts of this rule, taking into consideration the fact that we will, as municipalities and regional and state bodies, will all feel the effects of implementation of this rule. So I do think there's a lot of attention being focused on this issue on a state level, and that there are efforts beyond the city of Minneapolis to collaborate to identify who is impacted and how to support those populations.
Great, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Oh, so the next subject I wanted to address was a potential reduction in refugee resettlement numbers. For the current fiscal year, which covers October 1, 2018 to September 30th, 2019, the refugee resettlement cap, so the number of refugees who can be resettled into the United States, is 30,000. The federal government is considering reducing that number to 0 for fiscal year 20 2020. So that would start October 1, 2019 to September 30th, 2020. There is a nonprofit organization that works on refugee resettlement called International Institute of Minnesota that, in conjunction with other organizations, has been doing a great deal of outreach on this subject to explain what kind of impact that will have not only on communities here, and since the state of Minnesota does resettle, in the city of Minneapolis, for example, for this last fiscal year, has resettled 50 individuals, but also from the standpoint of the nonprofit organizations themselves. A reduction to zero will damage their capacity to assist refugees who may come to the United States in the future, even if the refugee cap is increased at some point down the line. So the reason that it's important to be especially aware of this now, and an article did appear in the New York Times over the weekend on this subject, is because of the fact that it can have such a damaging effect on communities, and the fact that this is the window where the federal government is about to make their decision, so likely sometime within this week. Another important topic is DACA deferred action for childhood arrivals. The federal government terminated the DACA program in September 2017. However, DACA renewals continued to be processed, and the matter was before several federal courts. There was a case going to the Supreme Court this fall to determine whether the federal government's termination of the DACA program was legal or not. So it's possible that we will see some movement on DACA sometime soon. It's important to be aware of that because DACA beneficiaries will require additional support in terms of advice, identifying what other options may exist. As far as Minnesota, the statewide impact ranges from 5,600 to approximately 9,000 people. 5,600 individuals who actually have DACA, 9,000 people who could qualify for DACA. Temporary protected status and deferred action are also important subjects to consider. For example, Haiti, Nepal, Honduras, Nicaragua, and El Salvador are countries that are protected, whose citizens who are in the United States are protected by temporary protected status. Temporary protected status allows individuals who are in the United States who are from countries that have experienced natural disaster or war or some other extremely challenging circumstance where the U.S. government says that the individual should, for humanitarian reasons, be allowed to remain in the United States. That's what temporary protected status covers. The federal government has terminated temporary protected status for individuals from the countries I mentioned. That decision is also subject to federal litigation, and while the litigation is ongoing, people who are in the United States pursuant to temporary protected status are allowed to renew their applications, but that is a very tenuous grasp on the right to stay in the United States because these individuals, and I believe that the number of individuals in Minnesota is 4,000, are not in a situation where they have a permanent right to remain in the United States.
Ms. Rivera?
Yes.
Rivera, I'm sorry. Do we know what impact this may have on victims of Dorian and Haitian immigrants that were living in the Bahamas and now are being forced because of natural occurrences to flee their country?
So the federal government determines based on certain circumstances whether to extend temporary protected status or to offer temporary protected status for individuals from specific countries. When there is a natural disaster, like Dorian, for example, the countries that are experiencing representatives of the countries that have experienced that type of natural disaster often petition the federal government of the United States to extend temporary protected status. There was, just to give an example, there was a volcanic eruption in Guatemala last year that impacted over 1.4 million individuals. The government of Guatemala petitioned to the U.S. government to offer temporary protected status, and the federal government did not do so. So it is an excellent question, but it remains to be seen. And if I can just offer my own perspective, I would feel pretty pessimistic about the government extending temporary protected status. However, I do feel that when people mobilize for a specific request, for example, deferred and forced departure for citizens of Liberia, DED is similar to temporary protected status. The federal government was considering terminating DED altogether, but partially or in large part because of an outcry in community, the federal government extended DED for Liberians for an additional year. So I do think that there is value in mobilizing community to advocate for this specific benefit in certain instances. So one additional subject that's important to touch upon is the government's continuous infringement on the right of people to seek and obtain asylum in the United States. Asylum law is fairly well settled. People do have the right to apply for asylum in the United States, and yet we are seeing through Board of Immigration Appeals decisions and proposed regulations, the federal government trying to make it more difficult for asylum seekers to apply for asylum and obtain asylum. And then for people who are actually applying for asylum, making it more difficult for them to be safe here in the United States. And one recent example that's worth noting is on September 9th, the government issued a proposed rule stating that asylum applicants who are filing for work authorization, normally those applications must be processed by regulation within a 30-day time frame. So the government is proposing eliminating that rule. The reason that that rule exists is that people who are applying for asylum in the United States often come here with absolutely nothing. Asylum applicants are eligible to file for work authorization after their application has been in process for 150 days. And having a 30-day processing time makes it easier for asylum applicants to be able to live safely in the U.S. because it gives them an option to work. It gives them the possibility to work. Eliminating that rule that states that asylum-based work authorization applications must be processed within 30 days would put asylum applicants' work authorization card applications within the same time frame of other work authorization applications, which typically take between 6 and 7 months to process. So increasing the instability of this already vulnerable population. So upcoming opportunities and then suggested actions. The city of Minneapolis is hosting a Welcoming Week celebration on September 20th in Powderhorn Park. This is an opportunity for community to celebrate together, to celebrate our diversity, to learn about each other. We have a number of individuals participating, including the American Civil Liberties Union, nonprofit organization, Legal Partners, and there will be a program including performances. There will also be a Hora Latina, so from 4:30 to 5:30 there will be an hour of Latinx programming in celebration of Latinx Heritage Month. These opportunities to celebrate and be in community together are very valuable. They're also extremely helpful in identifying what concerns people have in community and how to address those concerns. It's also,
I'm gonna
yes.
just, I don't want to assume, but there will be coordination with Census 2020 folks as well,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Also, in order to identify, for individuals to learn more about immigration-related topics and impact on our local communities, we also have learning labs that are hosted by NCR, and there'll be immigration-focused learning labs in October. So, with regard to suggested actions, the city of Minneapolis has taken bold steps to provide funding for legal service organizations that offer immigration-related legal services to residents. The mayor has proposed increasing the amount of financial assistance or support for legal service organizations from $75,000 to $100,000. As far as an example of what legal services provide, or this support provides, Mid-Minnesota Legal Aid, which is not funded by the city for immigration-related legal services, as I indicated before, operates a hotline where anyone can call and receive advice regarding the public charge rule. This is a crucial service, especially now. It also can't be overstated how important access to counsel is when a person is in immigration court proceedings. For detained immigrants with counsel, they are nearly 11 times more likely to seek a way to stay in the United States than those without counsel. For non-detained immigrants, they're 5 times more likely to obtain, to seek relief if they have an attorney. In addition, immigrants with legal representation who are detained are twice as likely to win the benefits that they seek if they're represented. And people who are not detained are 5 times more likely to obtain immigration benefits if they're represented than if they're unrepresented. So facilitating access to immigration legal services to the maximum amount possible, given our limited city resources, is one of the most important ways that the city can truly be a welcoming city by facilitating access to counsel. That also significantly assists immigrant and refugee communities in achieving integration in our city. With regard to access to information, OIRA is making a concerted push to ensure that neighborhood organizations, Minneapolis public schools, health department partners, and faith-based institutions are aware of the resources that exist to provide legal information and advice to community members. Community-based organizations have been very important, especially now. Organizations like Release Minnesota 8, Black Immigrant Collective, and Navigate function as navigators. So ensuring that people, sometimes it's challenging for people to look at a website and identify, well, what should I do with this information? It's very helpful to have someone guiding you. And organizations like this perform this essential function, and some operate on a shoestring budget. They're crucial in providing support to immigrant and refugee communities. Another suggested action is establishing clear protocols for investigating ICE's use of force. As I indicated, we have an informal protocol. This is a discussion that particularly with regard to situations where ICE actions result in damage to property or injury. It's a discussion that includes Minneapolis Police Department, the City Attorney's Office, and others. As far as a phone hotline, additional resources to increase internal capacity and external support, we are in conversations with one of the nonprofit organizations that provides legal services to identify whether it's possible to establish a hotline that would always be on, and what the cost for that type of a service would be. We're also looking for additional resources to increase capacity. Within the Department of Neighborhood and Community Relations, we are trying to identify sources of grant funding that can support this work. Also, within the University of Minnesota Humphrey Institute and Law School, we have collaborations with those offices that provide interns that help do the work to support immigrant and refugee communities. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to present before you today. That concludes my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Ms. Rivero. Are there any questions? Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Not a question, just a really heartfelt thank you. When I see the item number 3 here, or number 2, ensure community members have access to information, I just want to share with my colleagues that our staff has had the opportunity to work with my place of worship as we became a sanctuary congregation, and our members have relied on our city staff, Michelle in particular, to give us information not just about sanctuary for people who potentially could be deported, but also for asylum seekers. And now we're moving towards using an apartment that we have potentially for asylum seekers. It is a very complicated area of the law. And with all of the lawyers at my congregation, we still needed Michelle to give us information about how to even explain the difference between sanctuary and asylum and how that works. I'll also note that we did have someone in sanctuary at our sanctuary, and unfortunately, for a number of reasons, he felt the need to leave and was arrested not 2 days later and placed in the Sherburne County Jail along with 300 other people. Half of the total population of the jail is made up of people who are there due to immigration-related issues. So this particular person needed sanctuary, and the second he left, he was picked up and now will likely be deported. It's just a terrible situation. And so I think the more we can have professionals like Michelle talking to other professionals in the neighborhood under this area of ensuring community members have the resource information they need in order to do their part, that's what makes a difference. None of us are really going to be able to do much unless we're going to provide asylum for someone in our own homes. But in the end, our networks are what will matter. If everyone can talk to their network. My network happened to be faith-based, and some of yours might be too. But your network is what's important, and know that we have someone. I mean, I haven't even had to talk to our staff because you've been talking directly to people in my world in order to help make it happen. So thank you. It's you're probably surprised to hear the outcome of our particular case, but we're on to the next opportunity that we have to help someone seek asylum, and hopefully others will become involved in that as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Goodman. I'm so glad you brought up that issue, though, because so many people in our community are being incarcerated simply because of immigration status issues. It's deeply unfortunate, but I think the importance of this presentation is that it gives us as council members the information and the awareness to be able to share this information with our networks, as you mentioned, with our communities and our constituencies as we try to work through these issues. Are there any other questions or comments, concerns folks want to emphasize? I know a lot of times people think of immigration issues as simply, South American or Mexican, but immigrants come from all over the world, and they are black and brown. They are coming from African countries and other parts of the world. And so this is absolutely all of our issue and all of our concerns. And so thank you, Ms. Rivera, for that really detailed update. And with that, I move to receive and file this update. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed say nay.
Thank you.
That item carries. Thank you so much. I do want to note before we move into our committee reports that we have been joined by Council members Goodman and Warsami. We will now hear from our committee chairs, and the first committee being the Budget Committee chaired by Councilmember Palmisano.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As all of my colleagues here are aware, we received Director Intermill's overview of how the levy proposal got made in our first Budget Committee the other day. Also, tomorrow we will be having, and thus for Friday's council meeting, we will have received reports by the Police Department, Fire, and the City Attorney at tomorrow's Budget Committee meeting, and I request and expect that there will be some thorough discussion on that. There's a public hearing tonight at the Board of Estimate and Taxation, and that is a public hearing on setting the levy proposal. So that's what's going on in Budget Committee, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Chair Palmisano. I thought you said you were firing the city attorney. I just you ran those things all together, and
the fire department.
I was a little shocked. We love our city attorney. We don't want her to get fired.
She's not off the hook yet.
Are there any questions for Chair Palmisano other than that clarification? Seeing none, we'll move to the next committee report, the Economic Development and Regulatory Services Committee, chaired by Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. We have 9 items that we're bringing forward for approval on Friday. Item number 1 is a bond issuance for Hillel Center on University Avenue. Item 2 is an on-sale liquor license for Bar Brava. Item 3 is a license for one fermentary tap room. Item 4 are the liquor license approvals. 5 are the renewals. 6 are the gambling license approvals. 7 are the renewals. 8 are business license operating conditions for Provision Community Restaurant, and 9 are some contract amendments with eligible providers for employment and training. I'm happy to answer any questions about those items.
Thank you, Councilmember Goodman. Are there any questions? Any questions? Seeing none, our next committee report is the Elections and Rules Committee, given by our chair, Councilmember Ellison.
Thank you, Council Vice President. The Elections and Rules Committee has one item. It's the passage of a resolution designating and prescribing polling places together with election precincts and the boundaries thereof, inclusive of 2 new precincts in Wards 3 and 10 in the city of Minneapolis. And that's it.
Are there any questions? Thank you. The next committee report is the Housing Policy and Development Committee, given by Chair Gordon.
Thank you very much, Vice President. The Housing Policy and Development Committee is coming forward with 7 items. The first 3 are land sales. One is to Visitation Monastery. Another is for home buyers. And the third is also for home ownership opportunity, all in North Minneapolis. The 4th item is just a staff direction directing staff to include the comments received at a public hearing into our Consolidated Annual Performance and Evaluation Report to HUD. The 5th item is probably the most noteworthy. It's the passage of an ordinance amending Title 12, Chapter 244, the Renter Protections Ordinance. The committee is bringing that forward with 2 amendments that are now incorporated into the recommendation. The 6th item is a resolution granting approval for Hennepin County's Redevelopment Authority to issue multi-housing revenue bonds for the Parkview Apartments. And the 7th item is to do the same for Homes Housing Partners. And I will stand for questions on any of those. There was some discussion, I'll note, in the committee about possible amendments that might be coming up Friday on the Renter Protections Ordinance, but I'm not aware of anything at this time that'll be coming forward.
Thank you, Councilmember Gordon. Are there any comments or questions for Chair Gordon? No? Seeing none, we will then move to our next committee report, the Public Health, Environment, Civil Rights and Engagement Committee, given by Chair Cunningham.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. The Public Health, Environment, Civil Rights, and Engagement Committee is bringing forward, I believe it's 8 items for council approval on Friday. The first is approving council and mayoral appointments to the Neighborhood and Community Engagement Commission, NCEC. Just so folks know, this we expect for this commission to actually sunset in about 6 months, given the future and the work that's happening around the Neighborhoods 2020, that various work. The item number 2 is passage of a resolution authorizing the one-time transfer of $150,000 from the City Coordinator's Division of Sustainability 2019 budget of franchise fee funding to the Health Department for the Green Cost Share Program. Item number 3 is accepting a grant from the Minnesota Department of Health for implementing the Safer Sex Intervention Project at the school-based clinics. Item number 4 is authorizing the submittal of a grant application to the Minnesota Department of Public Safety Office of Justice Programs for youth intervention programs grant for our Inspiring Youth program. Item number 5 is passage of a resolution. Actually, both 5 and 6 are technical amendments with funding strings. Item number 7 is approving a council appointment to the Workplace Advisory Committee. And item number 8 is directing sustainability, finance, health department, and attorney's office staff to bring forward to the Public Health, to the Peace Committee, a recommendation or set of options for a social cost of carbon to be considered for adoption by the City Council no later than November 18th of this year. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Chair Cunningham. Are there any questions? Are there any questions? Seeing none, the next committee report is the Transportation and Public Works Committee, given by Chair Wright.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. The committee report in 7 items. The first 2 are contract amendments for previously approved work of the department. Item 3 is an MOU with the Park and Rec for solid waste recycling services. 4 is negotiation with Metro Transit for cost participation related to the D-Line Bus Rapid Transit project. 5 and 6 relate to our assessment in lieu of taxes for non-governmental tax-exempt parcels for both street and light operations. And the final item is the 26th Avenue South project between East Franklin and South 9th Street, actions to proceed with that project. I'll stand for any questions, Madam Vice President.
Thank you, Chair Wright. Are there any questions? Any questions? The next committee report then would be the Ways and Means Committee, given by Chair Warsame.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. The Ways and Means Committee brings 10 items for the Council's approval on Friday. The first item is a legal settlement. The second item is a contract with RBG Global Asset Management, Government Portfolio Advisors, T. Rose and Associates, and Galliard Capital Management for investment management services. Item number 3 is a contract amendment with LifeWorks Services, Inc. for courier services. Item number 4 is a contract with the state of Minnesota for air quality monitoring stations on city property. Item number 5 is a contract with Be Graceful Bakery and Catering for the public service building. Item number 6 is an agreement with Red Lake Nation for sprung structures. Item number 7 is a bid for Americans with Disabilities Act and all gender restroom improvements project at multiple facilities. Item number 8 is a gift acceptance from Kelly Duran to supply Minneapolis 911 response officers with Narcan. Item number 9 is a contract amendment with Downtown Improvement District for policing in downtown Minneapolis. And item number 10 is a contract amendment with Meet Minneapolis for sales and marketing of the Minneapolis Convention Center and convention and tourism services for the city. And I stand for any questions.
Thank you, Chair Warsame. Are there any questions? No? Our next committee report is the Zoning and Planning Committee, given by its chair, Councilmember Schrader.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. The Zoning and Planning Committee will be bringing forward 6 items for approval on Friday. The first is the approval of making a council appointment to the Zoning Board of Adjustments. The second is the granting of a variance appeal at 5420 Colfax Avenue South. The third is the granting of a variance appeal to 3406 Benjamin Street Northeast. The fourth is the approval of a rezoning to at 10 West 46th Street. Number 5 is the approval of rezoning at 4367 Thomas Avenue North. And the 6th is the approval of a street vacation on 7th Street North between Glenwood Avenue North and 2nd Avenue North. And I'll stand for questions.
Thank you, Chair Schrader. Are there any questions? The next committee report is the Audit Committee, given by Chair Palmisano.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The meeting this morning was to publish the off-duty work audit of the police department, and we had a lot of thorough discussion in that committee. So that report is now public and published to the website, and I am happy to answer any questions, but it's not something that we will be bringing forward on Friday.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Our next committee report then would be the Executive Committee report, and that report will be given by Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Executive Committee is bringing forward 2 items, both collective bargaining agreements, one with the Fire Chiefs Union and one with the Professional Engineers Unit, and I'm happy to stand for any questions.
Any questions? Any questions? Seeing none, that completes our business for this committee, and we are adjourned.